Hi Centrepoint, nice to be talking to you again. We're carrying on with our series in the Psalms today, but before we open up our psalm, I asked a couple of you, what's changed between now and this time last year? And this is what you had to say.
Our dog Billy had some puppies and we have online school.
I am more unhealthy. So I spent the first few days doing Joe Wicks's workouts. Maybe you've done those. Probably lasted about a week. I've stopped that and now I'm just eating loads of cheese.
There's been no school, no seeing of friends, and no birthday parties or anything like that.
I spend more time in my pyjamas.
Since last year, all my friends have gone off to uni and I was left here, so big change.
The world is changeable, right? This time last year, coronavirus didn't exist, you would have all still been in school, we'd never heard of the term social distancing, and you could freely meet up with your friends and give them a hug. But the world's always been movable, but that's been made even more clear to us in the last few months. And with all the changes and the movableness and the shakiness of life, is it possible to be still? Is it possible to not be moved? Or do we all just get bashed around with the rest of the world? Well, our psalm tells us that there is a way. In fact, our psalm assures us that today, if you're a Christian, then you cannot be moved. I'm going to read the psalm for us today. It's on the handout. If you haven't printed that off yet, go do that now and grab a handful of colouring pens. So I'm going to read Psalm 125 for us. A song of ascents. Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved but abides forever. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people from this time forth and forevermore. For the sceptre of wickedness shall not rest on the land allotted to the righteous, lest the righteous stretch out their hands to do wrong. Do good, O Lord, to those who are good, and to those who are upright in their hearts. But those who turn aside to their crooked ways, the Lord will lead away with the evildoers. Peace be upon Israel. Did you see that in verse 1? Look down again, that those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved, but abides forever. I guess if I asked you to pick anything on earth that's the hardest thing to move, I reckon you'd struggle to think of anything harder to move than a mountain. Maybe let me know at a Centrepoint chat on Zoom if you can think of anything harder to move. And this isn't just any mountain. This is Mount Zion. This is God's mountain. It's where Jerusalem was. And the Lord's people are told here that if you're trusting in the Lord, you are as unshakable, as immovable as a mountain. Even though it may seem like everything else around you is crumbling, if you're trusting in the Lord, you endure forever. You don't crumble along with everything else. But how? Why is it that those trusting in the Lord cannot be moved? Is it because of my particularly strong faith? Or my very impressive emotional stability? Well, grab your pens and have a look at the rest of the psalm, thinking about the question, why is it that those trusting in the Lord cannot be moved? And underline or circle any clues about why those trusting in the Lord cannot be moved. Great, so if you've done that, let's unpack a bit of what you've seen. Firstly, we see that those trusting in the Lord cannot be moved because the Lord surrounds his people forever, we see in verse 2. God's people have just been described as a mountain, and now they're described as a mountain surrounded by mountains. Did you see that in verse 2? As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people. To try show you what I mean, I've got two toy sloths. One is just sat there, and the other is surrounded by board games. And I'm going to throw my socks at them. The exposed one moved all over the place. It fell on the floor. But the one that was surrounded couldn't be moved. And in the same way as the Lord surrounds his people, they cannot be moved. He is surrounded on all sides. And we saw in the previous psalm that there were all kinds of threats of armies and floods that were threatening the Lord's people. Yet they were unmoved. The Lord surrounds his people. And if you're part of God's people, then he is surrounding you forever. He surrounds us now and forevermore. We see in verse 2. He's not going to stop. But then that might make you wonder, well, how can this psalm be saying that you're surrounded by the Lord when bad things are happening to you, even though you're trusting him? Or bad things are happening to other Christians you know? Maybe you or someone else is getting ill, or their mental health is really struggling right now, or you may have known someone who's lost a job. And it seems like they are being bashed around with the things of this world that are changing. Well, in this world, being surrounded by the Lord doesn't necessarily mean that no harm will come to you. If we look in the Psalm 123 that came 2 psalms before this, we saw that the travellers singing that psalm did experience difficult things. They were being scorned, they were being mocked. And yet those travellers being mocked were also able to sing the words of this psalm. They knew that they were still surrounded by the Lord. That nothing was going to be able to knock them off track of where they were headed. So being surrounded by the Lord now means that any harm that does come to us isn't anything that's going to be able to move us from being on the right path up to our final destination. Remember, these psalms were what they were being sung on a journey. It was a journey up to Jerusalem, but it points to the journey that all Christians are on, to the New Jerusalem, the place where we will be surrounded by God in all his fullness, under his complete protection forever. But it's at the destination and on the journey that the Lord surrounds his people. It's now and forevermore. And since we're surrounded by the Lord now, the shaky, changeable things of this world that hit us, they won't be able to move us from being on track to arriving at the New Jerusalem. And you know, we have even more reason to be confident of this than those who first sang this psalm. Jesus comes hundreds of years later, and he speaks of those who believe in him, those who are trusting in him, like this. He says in John, "No one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one." The Lord's people are firmly in the Father and Jesus' hands, surrounded, so cannot be moved from being on track to arriving at the New Jerusalem, where we'll be surrounded in him in all his fullness. But things are hard right now, but that won't always be the case. Which takes us to our next thing. Those trusting in the Lord cannot be moved because wickedness will not rule forever. We see in verse 3. I'll read that for us. "For the sceptre of wickedness shall not rest on the land allotted to the righteous." That word sceptre is like a big stick, like what the Queen has on her coronation, what people in authority hold. It has the idea of rule. And so we're told here that the rule of wickedness shall not rest, or it won't remain, on the land allotted that's been given to the righteous. And that tells us 2 things, something about the present and something about the future. It tells us that in the present, that wickedness is ruling where the righteous are. And it's worth saying that the righteous are those who are trusting in the Lord and therefore seen as right in his sight. And they are currently living in a world that seems to be run by wickedness. Maybe back then there was a king who didn't care about God, who was ruling in Jerusalem. But even now, we don't have to look far to see that the world is run by those who don't care about God. There is injustice that goes unpunished. There are Christians who can be treated badly on physical levels, or some people lose their jobs, but whatever it is. But the second thing we see about the future is that wicked rule isn't going to be the case forever. Those trusting in the Lord cannot be moved because one day the rule of wickedness will come to an end. For the scepter of wickedness shall not rest on the land allotted to the righteous. It's not going to stay there. Instead, God has set a future date when he will end that wicked rule. And in the New Jerusalem, it won't be wickedness ruling, but it will be the Lord's anointed king. And so because wickedness won't rule forever, the righteous don't have to join in with it now. Did you see the second half of the verse? Lest the righteous stretch out their hands to do wrong. So I know lockdown restrictions have been lifted a little bit recently, but even before they were, I was starting to see, and I bet you did too, people starting to break lockdown rules, people starting to meet up in groups when they weren't meant to. And I wonder if one of the reasons it's so hard to stick to lockdown rules is because we didn't know when it was going to end. We were just told that we couldn't see our friends and family indefinitely. And so people become more likely to get fed up and give up and break the rules. But if, say, I know it would have been impossible, but say we were told lockdown for 4 months and then it's definitely over. I think knowing that there's a certain end point, knowing that it's temporary and then it will be over, would have made people more likely to be able to stick to the rules when they were in force. Well, we know that God has a fixed date when the wickedness of this world will be gone away with. And so the righteous are able to resist joining in with that wickedness now. To not stretch out our hands to do wrong. And when we're in that place where wickedness is totally gone away with, we won't even be tempted to do wrong. The first time anyone stretched out their hand to do wrong was right back at the beginning of the Bible, where Adam and Eve stretched out their hand and took the fruit that God had told them not to take from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that's when wickedness started to rule in this world. Well, right at the end of the Bible, where it paints a picture of the New Jerusalem, that tree isn't there. There's not going to be another chance for wickedness to rule in the world and in my heart. Just think about how sweet that will be. You know when you're with your friends and they start talking about the person who isn't there and you know you shouldn't join in, but you have that really good piece of gossip and you kind of want to tell them, but you know you shouldn't, and oh. Or when it's late at night and you're alone and you know you shouldn't click that link, but part of you really wants to, but you actually don't want to, but you also kind of do want to, and oh. If you're trusting in the Lord, those feelings will be totally gone when we are in that place where it's no longer wickedness that rules, but God's good King. Those trusting in the Lord cannot be moved because he will make sure that the evil rule of this world comes to an end, so we can be fixed firmly forever. And we're further through the story than those who first sang the psalm. At the cross is where Jesus disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them. Jesus has already defeated the wickedness of this world. And we're now just waiting for the day where Satan and all those who are on this side are permanently cast away. and banished from the city that we're headed to. You see, the only reason anyone is able to be unmoved in a broken, changing, messed up world is by trusting in the Lord. Not your own strength or resilience, but depending on the Lord who surrounds those who belong to him, assuring us that nothing will get to us that will stop us from reaching our final destination, by trusting in the Lord who'll put an end to the wickedness of this world. But what does trust in the Lord look like? Well, did you notice in this psalm, the last 2 verses flip to a prayer? He asks God, he speaks to him. I'll read those verses for us. Do good, O Lord, to those who are good, and to those who are upright in their hearts. But those who turn aside to their crooked ways, the Lord will lead away with evildoers. Peace be upon Israel. This is a prayer where he's kind of just saying to God, okay then, do what you say you're going to do, God. And that's expressing trust. If you trust God to do it, then it's totally legit to ask him to do it. But as I read that, I did kind of cringe a bit, because what he asks him to do is do good to those who are good and turn away those who turn to crooked ways. But I know what I'm like. I know that I do so easily turn to crooked ways, and that I'm not very good. But actually, this psalm has already told us what it means to be good. In this psalm, to be good means to trust in the Lord. And the good that he's asking to do to those who trust in him is to keep surrounding them, to keep them on track to getting to that place where wickedness no longer rules. And the psalmist prays with confidence, knowing what God will do to those who don't trust in him. Even though for now it might seem like the evil of this world has the upper hand, the psalmist knows that that's not going to be the case forever. He knows that one day God will turn them away. They'll be led away with the evildoers, banished from that city that we are headed to. The psalmist is expressing his trust by just praying to God and saying, God, well, you've said it, so do it. And the psalmist finishes by praying for peace upon Israel, a plea for peace for God's people. And we know that God will fully answer that prayer when we are with him in the New Jerusalem, surrounded by him fully, free from evil. So this psalm isn't a psalm telling us to stand firm, don't be moved, don't move. It's a psalm shining light on what the situation already is. That if you are trusting in the Lord, then you cannot be moved. But instead you are surrounded firmly in Jesus' hands. The one who died, who beat wickedness at the cross and will one day cast it away permanently. So let's pray that we keep trusting in this Lord. And as the psalmist finished in prayer, I'm going to finish in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much that if we're trusting in you, we know that we are surrounded by you, and that therefore you will keep us on track, that none of the bad things in this life can stop us from reaching our final destination, because you surround us. And Father, thank you so much that Jesus has defeated evil, and one day we'll be in a place where there'll be no more evil, but instead Jesus will be ruling on his throne. Amen. So, just one thing to add. Hopefully you all know what is happening on the 10th to the 12th of July. Centrepoint House Party. It's obviously going to look a bit different this year because everything is looking different this year. But we're still going to have excellent talks looking at the person and the work of Jesus. And we're going to have chatbacks where we think through and you can ask your questions. And we're going to be meeting virtually, and we're hopefully going to be meeting physically in small groups, 2 meters apart from each other, subject to whatever restrictions and what is safe and sensible at that time. There's a link down below to a flyer, and you can do a really quick sign-up form to say that you're interested, and then we'll be in touch with more details. I'm really excited, and I hope to see lots of you there. See ya!